Among the many odd little quirks of humanity is a tendency to domesticate a wide variety of plants and animals. One of the oldest and most abiding patterns is the tending of herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. Various cultures have gone so far as conscripting dogs and horses in their efforts to look after these reliant ruminants. As it happens, there are often strange parallels to be found in the realms of the natural world. One group that seems to frequently run parallel to the human race is the family Formicidae, commonly known as ants. These redoubtable little insects certainly mirror human opportunism and versatility, to say nothing of having a penchant for aggression and a certain degree of dominion over their local ecosystems. Most insects have a tendency to avoid ants as a matter of survival, just as most animals tend to avoid humans. Yet, just as humans are prone to domesticating certain species, so too are the ants. Quite a few of the ant tribes are known for rather close mutualisms with aphids and similar homopterous insects. Incidentally, among the ants, the term tribe is used for a very specific and literal level of classification located between subfamily and genus. In any case, this widespread form of symbiosis involves the ants, their unusual livestock, and the plants upon which these livestock feed. So let us take a closer look into this curious association and see just how and why these potential prey are preferentially protected. To begin with, let us briefly consider the three major players within this drama. These are the plants, which are fed upon by the aphids and their ilk, which are in turn tended by the various ant species. The link within this trio is the sugary solution found first within the foliage. To put it another way, this is quite literally going to be a sappy story. Thus, the first step is to consider the sap itself, particularly its origins and composition. To gain a proper understanding, we must first address the curious duality inherent to typical plant life. With few exceptions, every plant may be broadly subdivided into a system of roots below the ground and a system of shoots above the ground. The former structures are quite effective at obtaining water and minerals from the surrounding soil. The latter support the photosynthetic structures commonly known as leaves. Photosynthesis involves two major effects. One is the capture of energy from available light, and the conversion of this energy into chemical complexity. The other is the synthesis of organic chemicals from inorganic carbon. In reality, these two effects are merely two facets of the same thing, as the organic chemicals inherently contain more energy than the inorganic carbon dioxide and water they are synthesized from. Of course, this additional energy must come from somewhere, and that somewhere is the incoming photons. Lest anybody should worry, I do not intend to go into the fine biochemical details of photosynthesis here. It is a fascinating process, to be sure, but it is somewhat beyond the scope of today's topic. However, it is important to understand the role of some of the major organic molecules produced as a result of this process. For the sake of simplicity, we will here consider only two classes of organic molecules. These are the carbohydrates and the amino acids. In plants, carbohydrates, or sugars, are used as a form of energy and the structural foundation of cell walls. Amino acids are used as the components of proteins, which include vital cellular enzymes. Essentially, a plant is mostly made up of water and polymerized sugar, with cellular machinery consisting of various proteins. This is admittedly an oversimplification, as cell walls also contain lignin, which is neither sugar nor protein, but that is another matter. As leaves are the primary sites of photosynthesis in typical plants, their tissues have no shortage of available sugars and amino acids. This is not the case with the rest of the plant. The roots and stems require organic molecules no less than the leaves, but they are generally not able to produce them. The roots in particular, being underground, must be entirely reliant upon other plant structures for their supply of both sugars and amino acids. Thus we come to the need for sap. Sap is carried in a specialized vascular tissue known as phloem. The counterpart tissue, xylem, is typically the route for water and minerals to travel from the roots to the leaves. Phloem, in contrast, is the general route for organic molecules to travel from the leaves to other plant tissues. While sap contains amino acids and other vital organic molecules, these components are vastly outweighed by the sugar content. There are two basic reasons for this disparity. First, sugars are quite easy to manufacture in comparison to amino acids. Only carbon dioxide and water are required. Amino acids also require nitrogen, which is somewhat more difficult for most plants to come by. It is a limiting nutrient, and it is no accident that most fertilizers include usable nitrogen sources. The second reason has to do with the composition of the plant tissues. Most of the structure is based upon polymerized sugars, and sugars are also a major form of long-term energy storage favored by plants. As a result, far more sugars are required for building and maintaining the plant tissues. While proteins are vital for cellular function, the amounts required are quite small in comparison to the sugars. It is also important to consider how the sap is transported within the phloem. In effect, the organic molecules are forcibly transported into the phloem vessels. This increases the concentration of dissolved solutes in the sap. Immediately, water diffuses into the vessels in answer to this difference in solute concentration. As a result, the sap within the phloem vessels becomes pressurized. One can most likely appreciate how having a pressurized system tends to facilitate fluid flow. Wherever the organic molecules are needed in the plant, they are transported out of the phloem vessels. Water follows them, reducing the local pressure. Fluid will always flow from areas of high pressure to low pressure so long as there is a viable path, so transportation across the plant is accomplished effectively by adding pressure in the leaves and removing pressure at the destination tissues. Now that we have this basic understanding of sap, let us move on to the aphids and their immediate relatives. These insects have mouthparts modified into a series of piercing stylets, which are used collectively to bore into plant tissues. The goal is to reach a suitable phloem vessel and effectively tap into it. As the sap inside is under pressure, the aphid does not even need to suck in order to obtain its food. It need only allow the fluid to flow freely into its digestive tract. This may seem quite easy, and indeed it is with such specialized mouthparts, but there is a problem with this particular diet. Aphids are animals, not plants. Their cells are not supported by cell walls. Instead, they are enmeshed within various forms of extracellular matrix. This matrix is based upon proteins rather than polysaccharides. In other words, an animal requires far more amino acids for tissue growth and maintenance. Now, amino acids are certainly present within the sap, but they exist in minuscule quantities compared to the sugars, and the water for that matter. So what is an aphid to do? The answer is simple enough. The little creature simply allows large amounts of sap to pass through its digestive tract as it skims off whatever organic molecules it requires. No additional energy is expended in obtaining greater quantities of sap as the phloem vessels are pressurized. Sugars are unavoidably taken up in abundance, but most of these sugars are returned to the lumen at some point. Sometimes there are minor changes, but generally speaking, the final result is as follows. What emerges from an aphid's hindquarters is not the typical waste one might expect from most animal species. Instead, it is mainly sugar water, and chemically it is quite similar to the sap the aphid originally imbibed. The common term for this saccharine solution is honeydew. Under the right conditions, one can find a profuse coating of this sticky substance accumulated beneath active aphid infestations. So now we come to the ants. Anybody who has a passing familiarity with ants will recognize two major points to their dietary habits. First, they are carnivorous little predators and scavengers, which tend to quite happily devour any number of available arthropods. Second, they have a rather distinct sweet tooth. The reason for this requires perhaps a little bit of explanation. Worker ants can be recognized in part by the narrow waist between the thorax and the abdomen. They also have relatively narrow necks, separating head and thorax. While these two regions allow for considerable maneuvering of both the head and the abdomen, they do present something of a problem. Only a very narrow digestive tube can pass through such narrow portions of the body. In effect, worker ants are restricted to a liquid diet. They even have a sieve built into their throats to prevent larger particles from entering their digestive system. After all, an obstruction would not be especially conducive to the little creature's health. With such restrictions, one might wonder why ants have chewing mouthparts rather than the piercing and sucking arrays found in aphids in their ilk. The reason is that ant mouthparts serve a role not unlike human hands. They are the primary means for the ant to manipulate its environment. Ants with piercing stylets would not be able to construct nests, or care for their larvae, or even properly clean themselves. So then what is the purpose of all of the protein the ants pursue in their predatory perambulations? Put simply, most of the prey the ants procure is not for the ants themselves. Rather, it is for the larvae back in the nest. The larvae are still growing and require a considerable amount of protein to build their developing tissues. Furthermore, they are quite capable of processing solid food. Indeed, in many species, the workers obtain what amino acids they require from the digestive efforts of the larvae. In contrast to the larvae, worker ants have effectively ceased all growth. As such, they require far less protein in their diet. All that is really needed is the limited requirements for simple cellular maintenance. However, what they do require in abundance is sugar. After all, a worker ant is by definition a busy little creature, and such diligent, sustained activities require a steady supply of energy. Of course, sugars can be found in abundance just beneath the surface of virtually any plant the ants happen across. However, they lack the proper tools to obtain this treasure of chemical energy. On the other hand, the aphids have precisely the right tools to tap into this supply, and they are troubled by an overabundance of sugar and water. In other words, they have an excess of precisely what the ants require. This, then, is the basis of the mutualism. The aphids provide the sugars the ants so desperately crave, while the ants in turn provide protection to the otherwise fairly vulnerable little insects. Typically, an ant need only approach an aphid and give it a few taps with its antennae. The little homopteron obliges by exuding a desired droplet of honeydew from its posterior. Let me once again emphasize that what comes from an aphid's hindquarters is nothing like the noxious excretion that results from more typical animal diets. It is mainly sugar water, along with whatever amino acids and vitamins the aphid failed to extract from the sap. Alas, the plants tend to lose out somewhat in this little drama. The steady loss of sap can be debilitating to begin with. The plant diseases that aphids and their ilk sometimes transmit make things all the worse. As if to add insult to injury, the accumulated honeydew droplets tend to foster the growth of mold species that can cause still further trouble for the plants. Yet, in a rather indirect manner, the plants may benefit in some minor ways. After all, aphids are not the only creatures that might feed upon a plant. There are any number of herbivorous little insects that may easily take a few bites out of the foliage. Their presence becomes somewhat less viable if ants are regularly visiting the plant. After all, even if the ants are farming the aphids, they are still quite eager to hunt other varieties of insect. Thus, though the aphids take their toll, the presence of at least certain ant varieties may shield the plant from other assaults. Indeed, there are many cases of ants entering mutualistic partnerships with plants, wherein the plant provides a habitat while the ants confer protection. It is not uncommon for the aphids, or their relatives, to be brought in as a sort of third partner in this mutualism. It is a burden to the plants to be sure, but the services of the ants may well outweigh the troubles from the aphids. At the very least, as the ants are there to clean up the honeydew, the plant is far less likely to become overgrown with mold. Though the ants are not without their little quirks, the aphids certainly have quite a few oddities of their own. They have a curious life cycle where they tend to produce clones through spring and summer and resort to the more conventional modes of reproduction only as autumn deepens and winter draws near. The advantage of asexual reproduction is the capacity to gain population very rapidly. The disadvantage is the genetic homogeneity, which tends to make this population more vulnerable to disease and other mishaps. This seasonal alternation allows the typical aphids to gain the best of both worlds. Yet one might ask why aphids must be so prolific in the populating of their preferred plants. While there is the possibility of peril from predation, there is perhaps a more pernicious provocation. Another name for aphids is plant lice, and this name is quite apt. Whatever else one might say about these little insects, they are, for all intents and purposes, specialized ectoparasites of plants. If there is one thing that parasites tend to excel at, it is rapid reproduction. Another thing that parasites tend to excel at is alteration and simplification. This is seen somewhat in aphids, where the clones are wingless creatures. However, the aphids are quite mundane compared to their close relatives, the scale insects. Scales are typically in the family Coccidae, and they feed in a manner much like that of the aphids. They are far more unusual and specialized in their overall anatomy and development, though. To properly appreciate these specializations, we must consider each of the life stages in turn. The average scale insect hatches from an egg, and what emerges is a tiny crawler equipped with legs and antennae. These larval forms are so small, they may be caught up in an errant gust of wind. With a bit of good fortune, they are carried to other plants. Even if they are unfortunate, they are produced in such numbers that at least a few are likely to find their way to suitable feeding grounds. Development tends to follow one of two paths, depending upon the gender of the little larva. If it is a male, it will go through a couple of larval molts, followed by a molt into a prepupal stage, and then a pseudopupal stage. What emerges at the end is a small, winged creature not unlike the aphids in overall appearance. These males take to the air in search of suitable mates, as is common among insects in general. The true specialization is seen in female scale insects. Here there is also a series of larval molts before adulthood. However, the adult is greatly modified as an ectoparasite. A typical female adult scale insect is flattened to some degree, with legs that are reduced to little more than clinging appendages. The mouthparts and digestive system are well developed, as are the reproductive organs. However, there is little else to the creature. She is effectively immobile, clamped securely into place on the plant stem, tapped into a phloem vessel for the duration of her adult life. One might expect such an immobile creature to be rather vulnerable to predation. An aphid can at least kick out at potential attackers with its legs. Scale insects lack even this meager option. However, they do have a defense of sorts. The majority of scales secrete a shield of wax over their bodies. Such wax may be glossy or crumbly or even fuzzy and filamentous. As wax is based upon lipids, and lipids are easily created from the excess sugars in the scale's diet, they can readily produce quite heavy shields for themselves. Such shielding may have camouflage functions as well, as scales are often not even recognized as animals. In many cases, they look like little more than boils or blisters on a stem, perhaps some unfamiliar protrusion of the plant itself. Of course, like the aphids, they also produce a steady stream of honeydew droplets. Unfortunately, this results in a combination of literally sapping the plant's energy reserves and covering it in a sticky solution that fosters the growth of dangerous mold species. There are species of scale insect that are regarded as significant agricultural pests, and a great many measures have been taken to control their populations in crop fields the world over. Still, there is something of an unexpected upside to at least a few varieties of scale insect. Carya lacca is a species commonly found in India and Thailand. It is known to some as the lac scale, that's LAC, as these little insects are not known for what they are lacking, but rather for the lac they produce. This lac is a resin, which is harvested and refined into shellac. For a time, this substance was the favored form of wood varnish. Interestingly, phonograph records were initially made from shellac in the days before vinyl. Even today, shellac has a number of uses and applications in various industries. Another unexpected product is derived from the species Dactylopius coccus. This little scale is found in South and Central America, as well as the southwestern United States. It feeds on cacti in the genus Opuntia. This particular species produces a defensive chemical known as carminic acid. This compound can easily comprise a good fifth of the insect's dry weight, making it rather unpalatable to potential predators. Another quality of carminic acid is its vivid red hue. When mixed with certain salts, this carminic acid becomes carmine dye, also known as cochineal. This red substance is found in a number of places. It has been used as a natural dye for fabrics for quite some time, and is also seen use as a pigment in certain paints. These days, it is not uncommon to see it used as a food additive, where it is otherwise known as E120 or natural red 4. Some might also recognize the terms carmine lake or crimson lake. Interestingly, there is another species of scale insect, Kermes vermilio, which is also used as a source of red dye. These scales are found in the Mediterranean region, where they typically live on the Kermes oak, Quercus coccifera. This scientific name roughly translates into the oak that carries berries, or more precisely, scale insects. The product of these scales is known as kermes, and it is a red dye that has been used since ancient times. In fact, cochineal was one of the earliest replacements for this particular dye. Returning to the insects themselves, there is an interesting intermediate group between the scales and the aphids. These are the Mealybugs in the family Pseudococcidae. As with the scales, the females retain a larval form into adulthood, and they produce a significant coating of defensive wax. This leaves most species looking a bit like tiny powdered trilobites. As with the aphids, they retain a degree of mobility as adults. The term mealybug most likely refers to the mealy or crumbly quality of the wax they produce. It tends to be a pale, powdery substance that is sufficient to dissuade at least some predators. However, with their ant attendants, many mealybug populations have little to fear from predation. In one particular species of mealybug, it is possible to see the fullest known extent of domestication by ants. The mutualist ants are similarly altered, at least in their overall habits. The species Malayococcus formicarii is found in Malaysian rainforests with its attendant ants of the species Hypoclinia cuspidatus. As with many aphids and related species closely associated with ants, the posteriors of these mealybugs are adorned with a halo of waxy bristles. These bristles collectively form a sort of basket about the backside that holds and retains honeydew droplets for the ants to more easily collect and imbibe. This does come at something of a cost, as these mealybugs have lost the behavior and capacity to flick the unwanted droplets away, should no ants be present to collect them. The ants are doting attendants, however. Not only do they keep watch over their little charges, but they also literally carry the mealybugs to optimal feeding sites on suitable plants. In particular, they favor the younger parts of the plant. As these plant tissues are still growing, there is a richer supply of amino acids in the sap, though sugars are still the major component. Between these rounds of feeding, the ants carry the mealybugs back to their nest for protection. The nest in this particular species consists of a tangle of ants occupying various natural hollows. This bivouac is not unlike what is found in army ants, although it is on a more modest scale. Overall, this arrangement is somewhat akin to farmers taking their livestock out to pasture each day to graze and returning them to some form of safe enclosure each night. As for the ants themselves, they appear to feed exclusively upon the excretions of their curious little cattle, although as fuzzy Mealybugs, sheep might be a more valid comparison for this particular sort of creature. Regardless, it would appear that each of these two species is entirely dependent upon the other. Without the ants, the Mealybugs are incapable of caring for themselves. Without the Mealybugs, the ants starve. It is an association at least as close and vital as might be seen in nomadic herders as a human equivalent. As an interesting side note, the ant genus Hypoclinia has a few other close associations with various Homoptera. For example, Hypoclinia gibbifer is known to actively carry Mealybugs in the genus Hippiococcus. Indeed, these little insects are modified with relatively long, grasping legs and suckers on their tarsi. When threatened, they will readily clamber onto the somewhat larger ants to be carried off to safety. While scales and Mealybugs are perhaps the more proficient wax producers, there are a number of aphid species that also produce such defensive compounds. The subfamily Eriosomatinae are known for producing coverings of filamentous wax that look a bit like cotton or wool. These creatures are commonly called woolly aphids, in fact. Being coated in a haze of fibrous wax would dissuade most predators to at least some degree. After all, what predator is likely to find satisfaction when biting into the prey yields only a mouthful of disagreeable fluff? Yet there is a variety of predator that has found a way around this defense, or rather perhaps through it. Lacewing larvae are sometimes known as aphid lions for their rather voracious habits with regards to aphids. I went into some detail regarding these creatures in an earlier video, but it is worth revisiting them here. These insect larvae have a pair of sharpened mouthparts that effectively function as hypodermic needles. These sickle-shaped jaws can readily find their way through the unwanted waxen wool and pierce the aphid underneath. From there, the little predator can easily drink the hapless creature to death. At least, unless the ants happen upon the scene. Much as a farmer might drive a wolf away from a flock of sheep, so the ants will make short work of the unwary lacewing larva. Yet there is an interesting little wrinkle in this tale, and it is seen in the species Chrysopa slocinae. This particular variety of lacewing will sometimes feed upon the woolly aphid species Procyphilus tessellatus. Alas for the lacewing, this is a species often defended by ants. Still, there is a technique employed by a number of larval Neuroptera which involves taking bits of detritus and affixing them to their backs as a form of camouflage. Chrysopa slocinae is very particular about the bits of detritus it chooses to adorn itself with. This intrepid little insect will lurk at the edges of a colony of woolly aphids and pluck fragments of woolly wax from their bodies. This does no great harm to the aphids, at least directly. Eventually, the predator accumulates a covering of wool all its own. Quite literally, it is behaving as a wolf in sheep's clothing. It appears as little more than a mobile ball of whitish fluff, with the only hint of malice being the pair of sharpened sickles protruding from underneath the wool. Thus obscured, it is able to move freely among the woolly aphids and their would-be shepherds, and dine at its leisure, altogether unnoticed, at least for the most part. Thus we see a peculiar drama unfold, like a fable told at a miniature scale, with three very different species of fluid-feeding insects. The parasitic aphid becomes a valued sort of livestock for the ant. The predatory ant becomes a doting attendant of the aphid. The predatory lacewing larva becomes a sneaking, deceptive creature clad in the raiment of its victims. Such curious roles and associations can be a source of considerable fascination and even amusement when one looks more closely at the strange livestock kept by ants. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Until next time.